Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Miller. Glad to be here. Over the course of this summit, we've heard all the grim statistics. We've heard what happens to young African American men, what their prospects are, and the statistics are pretty daunting. 49% of African American males arrested before their 23rd birthday. 1 in 3 African American males between the ages of 18 and 24 unemployed. They make up 1 million of the 2.3 million incarcerated. What does that mean? What results does that yield? Devastated families, broken homes, the casualties of untapped potential. How do we change that course? I'm going to tell you. Well, I won't tell you. These young men are going to tell you because they are beginning to help break the cycle. We're joined today by 3 men who are leading the charge in deploying groundbreaking strategies to chart a different course for Black men in America. Mayor Mitch Landrieu was reelected this year to a second term in New Orleans, determined to bring down a murder rate that had gone out of control. He launched Nola for Life, a comprehensive approach to fighting crime. Brian Stevenson, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. Love some Brian here. He advocates for the poor and the underrepresented. And David Kennedy, everyone, is the director of the Center for Crime Prevention and Control right here at John Jay College and is heading up the newly established National Initiative for Community Building and Trust. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. So we're going to start with you, Mayor Mitch, and we're going to talk about the fact that New Orleans is the murder rate capital of this nation. We're going to talk about the fact that Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate of any state in this country. You've inherited these monikers, and we're determined to change things in that town. How do you chip away at the reputation of this city, this state?
Well, reputation is going to follow what actually is. And I think the first thing to note is that if in America you want to believe that if you can get everybody to look at something and it doesn't look right, that we'll work hard to change it. And it was clear to me when I became the mayor of the city that although crime was a problem and continues to be in New Orleans and all over America, and by the way, everything I talk about is the same thing all over our country. It's in every community. One thing that was happening in New Orleans that I couldn't understand, and quite frankly, I'm not sure I understand it today, was the number of people being murdered every day. So my BlackBerry would, now my iPhone, my kids would be happy about that, would start buzzing and say, Mayor, last night, we're sorry to inform you that at 2:30, shots rang out. We arrived at the scene. We saw a young African-American man or 2 or 3 lying on the ground with bullet holes in the back of the heads. They're dead. There are no witnesses. And this relentless drumbeat of death would happen every day, every day, every day. And I said, this is unreasonable. This is unnatural. What in the world is going on? And then I read David's book. And David, in my opinion, understands this as well as anybody else in the country. But the facts are fairly stark, and I'll take you through them. Since 1980, in this country, 628,000 American citizens have been killed on the streets of America. 628,000. That's more American citizens that were killed in every war of the 20th century. That's a lot of people. And in New Orleans, the relentless drumbeat of death was continual. And it turns out that when you ran the numbers and looked at where they were, you found out that this was happening in 4 or 5 neighborhoods. And what you found out with the young men were between 16 and 25, 16 and 30. And here's the worst part, 88% of them knew each other. Now that meant to me that was a very targeted problem. And so when somebody asked me as the mayor, which they typically do, is your city safe? You're going to have the Super Bowl, is your city safe? The real answer is, well, it depends on who you are.
So did you give David a call?
Yeah, I called him right away. I did. I called him right away. As soon as I read his book, it was clear to me that David had lived many, many years of what I was beginning to experience as mayor of the city of New Orleans. And I said, please come help me formulate a response. And he did come down, and he's been a great asset. And we have created a program that we call Nola for Life, which is really our way of saying we're going to look at this from the front, the back, the middle. We are going to focus on it. The essential component is that the lives of young African American men are important, and that there is hope, and that they can be turned around, and that you can find a way to make it better for them and for the community. If you can't adopt that, you can't do the program. If you believe that, you can make it work, and it's going to be hard, the mountain's high, but we can get it done.
Let's get David in on this. Operation Ceasefire, part of this amazing program that he's talking about. How does it work?
So here's how it works, and we're the good news panel.
Yes, we are. This is. They're changing things. This is optimism at its best.
I've been here all day, and I'm really depressed. So we've got. I love this. We've got 23 minutes and 39 seconds.
So get on with it.
So before I encourage you, let me make you even more depressed, which is in New Orleans and everywhere else. So the national homicide rate now is down to about 4 per 100,000. It's an historic low. It's been falling since 1992. We all know that, right? During much of the last decade, the homicide rate for black men has been going up. The FBI statistics don't tell you that because you have to go looking, but it's true. And in New Orleans and in every other city with this issue, we can find those tightly woven networks in the hardest hit communities, and their homicide rate among, and they are mostly young black men, routinely reaches as high as 3,000 per 100,000. So divide 4 into that and you get the multiplier. So these are the neighborhoods where you get street shrines to the dead on the city corners. We now really know what to do about this. It's not perfect, nobody knows how to cure it, but because it is so few people, right? So many of the excesses that we've been hearing about today have been because we on the outside have been treating entire neighborhoods and really entire peoples as though they are dangerous. Troubled neighborhoods, birth cohorts, young black men exposed to risk factors, and in fact that is not the way it works. In the most dangerous neighborhoods, it turns out to be about 5% of the, and you're exactly right, about 18 to 26-year-old males who are even at high risk for either violent offending or victimization. And of that 5%, it's only about 1% that really drive things. So it's down to 1% of the young men in the most dangerous places. Most of them don't even like what's going on. They're caught up in all kinds of street dynamics. But this is to say that in the most dangerous places, even 99% of the young men don't like this. They're not active, they're not doing it. And we can change legislation, we can change sentencing, we can change all sorts of things, but we can also just change frontline practice. And if we focus on those young men and we don't lay hands on everybody else in the neighborhoods, we have a bigger effect on the problem and we don't lock everybody else up.
When you say focus in on them, what do you mean by that?
So my mother says I learned all of this from her. And actually, this is so common sense at the end of the day. They are readily identifiable. None of those, this is not undercover secret agent work. They're flagrant, they're out there. The frontline cops know who they are, the community knows who they are. So you can identify them, you can sit them down face to face, which they've been doing in New Orleans now for about going on 2 years. You can say to them, we know who you are, we know what you're doing. You are the highest risk people in this city for both getting killed and going to prison. We have organized this entire effort to keep you alive and out of prison. We are serious about this. We are sick of the way this has been going on. Your community needs you to understand that it rejects the violence. It may have been so angry at the police that it hasn't been too outspoken about this, but you need to understand nobody approves of what you're doing. We love you and cherish you and need you alive and out of lockup, and we're going to do everything we can to help you with that.
What is their reaction?
And we respect you enough as men to tell you ahead of time, we are putting you on notice of the legal consequences that will follow if you don't stop. And in 2 years, the homicide rate citywide in New Orleans has come down over 20%.
Yeah, it's the lowest that it's been in 30 years. But it's still way too high.
It's still way too high.
But it is really objective evidence that if you tell them that we love you and respect you, but this is what's going to happen. The next one of you that commits a crime, everybody in the world is going to come down on you and stop you because we can't let you shoot each other or anybody else. But if you don't, we'll put you in the front of the line for anything that you need, a job, mental health services, substance abuse, whatever. You got to be able to follow up on both of them so that they understand that the respect that you're giving to them is something that they mean, and consequences have actions. Good decisions equal good consequences, bad decisions equal bad consequences, but you have to be able to deliver, and it helps. But I would just say we have a long way to go.
It sounds like that old African proverb, it takes a village to raise a man. I mean, in essence, when you really think about it, down to the respect, accountability. Brian, let's talk about the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. What's happening there?
Well, we're a private nonprofit organization that provides mostly legal services to people, but we've watched the prison population just go through the roof. We've watched millions of people be placed on probation and parole. We've seen, over 60 million people be arrested. But more than that, I've seen great despair and hopelessness emerge in communities. And so what we're trying to do is just change the narrative. And that's a lot of the success of these interventions in communities like New Orleans and other cities. When you have a mayor that says, I want to value the lives of young African American men. I care about the young black and brown boys in my city, and I want to make sure we do everything we can to keep them safe. When you have interventions that are rooted in a commitment to their well-being, you're shifting this narrative, because the narrative that has emerged in American politics, which you've been hearing about all day today, is a narrative steeped in the politics of fear and anger. For 40 years, people have been competing with each other on who can be the toughest on crime. And you don't find many elected officials who will use the word rehabilitation or recovery or restoration. They certainly are not going to use the word love and outreach in these communities where there is so much despair. And that has created a crisis. And so what we're trying to do is to change that narrative. I want to start saying that when you are bipolar or depressed and poor and can't get treatment for your depression and you start using drugs, that doesn't make you a criminal. That makes you somebody with a disability who is poor. I want to say when you're a young mother and you want your children to eat and you don't want them to go hungry, and you start writing bad checks or even steal something, it doesn't make you a criminal. It makes you a bad mother with poor options, and you make bad decisions. When we change those narratives, we want different solutions. Children, this country has done something horrible to children, and it's been internalized. In the 1980s, we started talking about children as not kids. We said that some kids they look like kids, they talk like kids, but they're not kids. We came up with these words, and we labeled them super predators. Criminologists did that. And states reacted to that. And every state lowered the minimum age for trying a child as an adult. Now we've got 250,000 people in prison serving these long sentences. We've been saying all children are children. And we went to the United States Supreme Court with a narrative that changed, and now the court is starting to ban these excessive sentences. It's the beginning, and there's a lot more work to be done. But I think we have to change these narratives. We've got people in these communities that are suffering from trauma and victimization, and we're not dealing with them as victims. We think that there's a place for offenders and a place for victims. If you want to go where the most victimized people in American society are, go to a jail or prison. That's where you're going to find the highest rates of drug addiction and abuse. That's where you're going to find the highest rates of disability. That's where you're going to find the highest rates of people being abused and neglected. And instead of helping, we're looking for new ways to victimize them more. That has to change. And the kind of interventions that are succeeding are interventions that are rooted in recognizing that.
I find it interesting, David, you started... And you know how you jump in anyway, but I wanted to ask David this, because he didn't start his career off as a criminologist. You were moved by a moment in a neighborhood not far from where I grew up, in a place called Nickerson Gardens in Los Angeles. And what changed for you? What sent you on this path?
What made me a failed journalist? That's what happened. I saw things that middle-class white boys don't usually see. unless they're going into those places to buy dope, which thankfully I was not doing. I was doing field work with LAPD officers. And nobody really knows where crack started, but we kind of think it started in Compton and Nickerson Gardens. It's directly across the city line from Compton. It was ground zero in the crack epidemic. And it was the single most frightening place I had ever seen in my life. Not including adding to it the fear I was feeling, but just the people who actually lived there. The cops were afraid, the drug boys were afraid, their grandmothers were afraid, they couldn't come out of their houses. It was the first place I ever saw buildings where you could see the pockmarks where they'd taken gunshot rounds. And I had this absolutely unsophisticated, non-intellectual, visceral response, which was simply to look at this community in my country and think, nobody should have to live like this. And nobody should have to live like this. At that point, in 1985, there were probably about 400,000 people in prison in this country. And as we've spent the day, we've got another 1.9 now, roughly. And nobody should have to live like that either, right? Both of these sides are wrong. And then when you get into Mitch's neighborhoods and all these other neighborhoods, locking everybody up, putting hands on everybody, treating everybody with disrespect, has even further alienated neighborhoods that weren't that happy with the rest of us already. We have created this crisis of alienation and legitimacy, and nobody should have to live with that.
That's true.
Very interesting. You had a very different experience in Atlanta, Georgia, as a young lawyer. We've heard of DWB, but yours was like not driving while black, but sitting in a car while black. Tell us about that and how that impacted what you do today.
Sure. Well, I do think one of the great challenges we have is that black and brown people in this country are born with a presumption of guilt. That is the way they have to operate, because everywhere they go, there is this dangerousness that gets assigned to them, and that presumption of guilt creates all of these challenges, and that's why there is so much frustration when we militarize the police department, when people are not respectful. And it doesn't matter. I went to Harvard Law School, I did all these things, but when I was a young lawyer, I was just working on police misconduct cases. I came home one night and I had an old car, a Honda Civic, that was a fine car. I don't have anything against Honda Civics, but it was 1988 or something, and I was driving a 1967 Honda Civic or something.
I had an 87 Chevy Celebrity Hoopty, former police car, yet I understand.
I appreciate it. And in my car, the radio didn't work. So, that was my great frustration. Unless you ran into a fire hydrant, the radio wouldn't work. And one night I came out around midnight. I'd been working all day. Turned my car on, and magically, the radio came on.
Wow.
And not only did the radio come on, but they were playing songs by one of my favorite groups as a kid growing up. It's probably too old for this crowd, but I used to listen to Sly and the Family Stone every night. This is my kind of group. And they were playing all of the Sly songs. They were playing Dance and Hot Fun in the Summertime, Everybody is a Star, and I was just enjoying it. Got home to my new place in Atlanta and decided to sit there and listen to these Sly songs. A stand came on, and I was sitting in an Atlanta SWAT police car drove up, stopped about 20 feet from where I was parked, and I saw this cop get out. He was dressed in black. Those days, they wore black boots, black pants, black shirt. And I said, I'm going to go let him know that this is where I live. I was looking around looking for the crime, couldn't find anything. Opened the door, and as soon as I stood up, this officer pulled his weapon 15 feet away from me, and he said, "Move, and I'll blow your head off." And I put my hands up, and I said, "It's all right, it's okay." And he said, "Move, and I'll blow your head." His hands were shaking, and I thought he was going to kill me. And I put my hands up. Officer came out back. The other officer threw me on the back of the car. Completely illegal search of the vehicle. Neighbors were gathering, asking the police to ask questions about me. Ask him if he took my vacuum. Ask him if he took my cat. Completely humiliating. And I'm standing there watching this illegal search. They wouldn't let me get my wallet out of my pocket. At the end of the night, they realized I hadn't done anything, but they wouldn't apologize. What the officer said to me is, "We'll get you next time." And the thing that bothered me the most about that, I decided to file a complaint without revealing that I was a lawyer. So I wrote a 9-page, tight, single-space complaint. I think there were like 15 cases cited or something. But I didn't say I was a lawyer. And I never got any response from the police department acknowledging wrongdoing. But the burden for me was not just what happened to me. I remembered thinking that that same thing had happened to me when I was 20 or 24 or 16 or 18. I would have run. That's what I would have done. And it wouldn't have been an irrational thing to do. And so I was burdened with the anxiety of, do the young kids of color know not to run? So I was running all over Atlanta, grabbing kids, trying to make sure they understood how to say it's all right, it's okay. And no one should have to live with that burden. But these presumptions of guilt have developed because we haven't actually talked about the legacy of racial inequality, the way it's shaped our thinking. And that's why our solution, one of our solutions, is to really start talking more honestly about that history, about the history of slavery, about the history of terrorism, about the history of segregation. We're celebrating. It is a challenge for us because we like to celebrate civil rights, but we don't like to talk about all the damage that was done by humiliating African Americans every day of their lives. We damage them, and that damage is going to express itself. And so we've got to challenge these presumptions of guilt and dangerousness by talking honestly about what the legacy of racial inequality has done.
In essence, what you're talking about is varying forms of police brutality. And moving on to Mitch now, in a city that you govern that has a notorious history with police brutality, police misconduct, strained relationships with the community before Hurricane Katrina, certainly after the Danziger Bridge, the overturning of that case. How have you worked to restore relations and relationships?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, that's really sad, what happened to you. That hurts my heart. And he made a couple of comments that I want to put an exclamation point on. First of all, I love our country. I think we're a great country, and we do a lot of great things well, but we do a couple of things poorly. And one of the things we do really poorly is talk about race. We don't really do it at all, actually. We yell at each other. And as I like to say about race, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it, you got to go through it. And until we learn in this country to have a constructive discussion of it, and one of them is not ignoring history, by the way, that's not constructive, then we're going to have a really hard time. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is this, is that every country, the greatest strength that every country has is each of us individually, right? And making sure that the capital that we possess in our bodies, we have the ability to realize all the gifts that have been given to us, and then we become indivisible. And if we waste or we throw away or we don't think a certain group of people in America is valuable, we're going to be less strong as a country. And so one of the things that it occurred to me, and I heard it on the earlier panel, one of the parents who was talking about one of their children that was incarcerated and had some really difficult mental challenges, talked about his son thinking that one of his acts was rational. I remember listening to these stories of these kids shooting each other, and I had a couple of press conferences, and I said, this is irrational. This doesn't make any sense that you would walk up to somebody that you know and shoot them in the head because they just disrespected you the day before. That's not in my wheelhouse. And it turns out after I talked to these kids that it was perfectly rational to them because they said, in my world, if you don't shoot, you're going to get shot. And the fact, we have to admit that we have created an environment in which our young children, who could just as soon be my sons, think that the way to solve a problem is to shoot each other in the head. Now, there's something that we're doing that's wrong. If that current set of circumstances, and we can argue all day long about whether it's personal responsibility or institutional bias or history, and it could be all of the above. I would like to say this, that African American men are really important, and they're really valuable. And unless this country makes that clear statement, it's going to be hard for us to get to where we need to be, because one of the things that we are good at is being tough, but we're not really great at being smart on crime. And so in juvenile justice, where you spent most of your time, we're finding out that we're arresting too many of the wrong people and not enough of the right people. And this buckshot scattershot is making us spend a fortune, which is why you had Grover Norquist on the stage today, where conservatives in America are beginning to say, wait, this doesn't even make any financial sense anymore, right? So at the end of the day, we have to have safe and secure streets, and we have to have a way to secure people that are going to hurt each other and ourselves. But we don't have to put everybody in jail because they don't fall into the categories that make any sense. And in New Orleans, that gets you to the issue of what an individual's relationship is with the government and with the society and their most immediate reaction is with the police department. And so we're under federal consent decree. We have been working really, really hard to retrain, resupervise, make sure that every one of the police officers knows what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. In the Nola for Life program that we have a multi-agency gang unit that gets after the guys that are shooting each other with AK-47 and guns in the head, but we're also calling them in and saying, if you stop, we're going to give you a pathway to a better place, and then making sure it happens. We now have a job training program. This will make you weep. 52% of the African-American men in the city of New Orleans are not working. That's not sustainable. And guess what? We're not the only place in America where that's happened. So job training programs, right, where you identify a job and a human being, then you have to have the thing that connects them together. And then, as you said, you have to nurture them into a place where they could go. On the panel before, the guy talked about the kid that he got a scholarship for, and he never showed up. He needed somebody to bring him there. He needed somebody to follow him. He needed to be treated like a parent would treat a child and love and nurture him into a productive place. That's the kind of knitting that we have to do. But here's the thing, it works. If you do it, it's an amazing thing that you will take an individual that you think has gone in the wrong direction and form them correctly, and they will do magnificent things.
Yeah. So we know what you're doing. We know what these gentlemen are doing. I'd like to know what you all think the rest of us should do. What as individuals can we do collectively and as individuals to be a part of this change?
Well, I'll start with it. I think we should demand from our political leaders that we reduce the prison population in this country by 50% in the next 6 years. I think that if we don't do that, people will be talking about reform for the next 2 or 3 years, and we won't have any real way of measuring whether we're actually achieving the reform that we see. We've got 1 million people in jails and prisons that are not a threat to public safety, that can do well on the outside, that will not increase violence, and we've just got to create the political will to do it. Crime policy is local, so we need people to go to their various communities and just say, I'm comfortable saying we can do this, but I think if we don't start articulating real goals, stop treating drug offenders as criminals, let's eliminate mandatory sentencing. It doesn't serve anybody's interests to not be able to look at someone's disability or profile or context. But I'd like to articulate this 50% goal and just see how close we get. Mm-hmm. If we don't, we'll have a prison population of 2.2 million in 5 years, and we'll be celebrating when we shouldn't be. We should still be mourning. We've got the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and we're not ashamed. We've got to create some shame in the American consciousness about what we have done in mass incarceration.
And I don't want to run out of time before we hit on Ferguson, and I'm going to start with you, David. We talk about the importance of rebuilding communities, rebuilding that trust, and certainly the trust with law enforcement. But as we await the findings of this grand jury on whether or not they're going to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot and killed Michael Brown, we all know that that community is teetering on the edge, and people are talking about other communities waiting to hear what will happen. How do we begin to explain to America whether or not if he is not indicted, how do we explain to African Americans what happened? This young man is dead. This young man is dead. An unarmed African American man is dead.
So there is nothing that happened in Ferguson except the public reaction afterward that hasn't happened over and over and over and over again across the country. The only thing that's different about it is that it has somehow become Ferguson, right? I'm out there all the time, and there is the only thing I'm hearing in every city is people in law enforcement and people in communities saying, I am scared to death. This could be us tomorrow. It could be us this afternoon. Everybody feels this simmering or worse. And if we had not just heard this story about sitting in your car and getting proned out, and all those stories piled on top of one another, and everything we've heard today about these neighborhoods getting locked up intergenerationally, and on and on and on and on, if those things were not happening, then these killings would be awful. They would perhaps be illegal. We'll see what the system says about that. But they would not be what they are seen to be, which is yet another deliberate moment in centuries of deliberate oppression of a people under color of law, right? That's what turns the incident into the riot. And the only way out of that I see is first we need to stop locking everybody up, and fortunately there is a movement there. But even more importantly, it's what both these gentlemen just said. We have to face facts, we have to face history, we have to go to angry communities and say, and it has to come from the authorities, right? And say, you are right to be angry, we get it, we have done wrong historically, we have done wrong over the last 40 years. We didn't mean to do you damage. Nobody wearing this uniform today is a racist working with the Klan, but people wearing this uniform did, and we're going to own that, we're going to say we are sorry, and we are determined to do different.
And on that,
Very good.
and on that, we will have to end this panel, Breaking the Silence. David Kennedy, Brian Stevenson, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, we thank you.
Thank you.